Sarah and Mark White seemed like the perfect suburban couple, devoted parents, loving partners, and the envy of their picturesque neighborhood. But behind closed doors, Sarah harbored a dark secret, one that would unravel their idyllic life and lead to a night of betrayal, obsession, and murder. Sarah White was the picture of suburban perfection. She lived in a quiet neighborhood where neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences painted the ideal of domestic bliss. Married to Mark, a successful real estate agent and mother to two bright, lively children, Sarah seemed to have everything anyone could want. She was active in the community, baking cookies for school fundraisers, organizing neighborhood potlucks, and always ready with a smile for her friends and neighbors. But beneath the veneer of this idyllic life, Sarah carried a secret. It wasn't an affair in the traditional sense, or even a hidden vice like gambling or substance abuse. It was something she couldn't bring herself to explain, not even to her closest confidants. Sarah had discovered an outlet for her dissatisfaction with her life, a clandestine world that offered her an escape from the monotony of her day's anonymous encounters facilitated by glory holes. Her double life began innocuously enough. On a rare evening out alone, Sarah stumbled upon an inconspicuous venue while wandering downtown. It was tucked between a laundromat and a rundown diner, its nondescript exterior offering no hint of what lay within. Curiosity and boredom led her inside. What she discovered was a world that was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. She left that night, her heart racing and her mind buzzing with questions. But the experience lingered, haunting her thoughts. At first, she dismissed it as a fleeting curiosity, something absurd and reckless she'd never do again. But as the days turned into weeks, Sarah felt the pull of that world intensify. Her life, so carefully constructed, began to feel suffocating. Mark was a good husband, but their relationship had long since lost its spark. The children, though she loved them deeply, consumed her every waking moment. There was little left for herself, and what remained was buried beneath the crushing weight of routine. She returned to that venue one night, telling herself it was just to see, to remind herself of how foolish she'd been. But the thrill of anonymity, the electric charge of stepping outside her carefully curated life, proved irresistible. What began as a sporadic indulgence quickly became a habit. Sarah discovered other locations, each offering the same illicit sense of freedom. She kept meticulous notes in a journal hidden deep in her closet, detailing the times, places, and her emotions. She justified her actions by compartmentalizing her life. To her, this wasn't cheating, it was something else entirely, an outlet that existed in a separate realm from her marriage. Yet, even as she embraced this new side of herself, Sarah couldn't shake a gnawing sense of guilt. She knew she was playing with fire, but the danger only made it more addictive. Sarah believed she had found a way to live two lives. What she didn't realize was that the walls separating them were far thinner than she thought. And as her obsession deepened, those walls began to crack, setting the stage for a devastating collapse. Sarah's secret life was no longer a fleeting indulgence, it had become a full-blown obsession. What had started as occasional visits to escape her mundane existence turned into regular nocturnal escapades. Every time she walked through her front door after one of her excursions, she would take a moment to calm herself, adjusting her face into the serene mask of the perfect housewife. But deep down, she felt herself slipping further into a world she could not share with anyone. The thrill of anonymity, which had initially drawn her in, began to shift. At first, she relished the faceless nature of her encounters, the complete lack of personal connection. But over time, she found herself craving something more. It wasn't just the physical sensation she sought, it was a connection to someone who understood her hunger for a secret life. Her journal, once a simple catalog of dates and locations, evolved into a detailed narrative of her experiences, desires, and the people she encountered. Among the fleeting figures that passed through her hidden world, one stood out. Sarah noticed him immediately, a tall man with distinctive tattoos winding down his forearms. She saw him more than once, his presence becoming a steady fixture in her visits. Though they never spoke or exchanged names, she began to anticipate his appearances. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a strange comfort in his presence, a sense of familiarity in a world that thrived on anonymity. Her journal began to focus on him, describing his tattoos, the way he moved, and the unspoken connection she felt whenever they were in the same space. She started timing her visits to coincide with his, finding patterns in his routines. For the first time, her anonymous life felt personal. As her fixation on the tattooed man grew, so did her recklessness. She began staying out later, making flimsy excuses to cover her absences. She spent hours online, researching forums and communities tied to her secret world, hoping to uncover more about him or someone like him. The effort consumed her, bleeding into her daytime life. Mark, ever the attentive husband, noticed the changes. Sarah had always been attentive and organized, but lately she seemed distracted. Dinners were forgotten, the children's schedules left incomplete. When he asked her about it, she brushed it off as exhaustion. "Just too much on my plate," she'd say with a weary smile. But her dismissive tone only fueled his suspicions. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself increasingly paranoid. The more she invested in her secret world, the more she feared it might unravel. She double-checked her hiding spots for her journal and deleted search histories compulsively. She told herself she had everything under control, but the truth was, her obsession was controlling her. As she spiraled deeper into her fixation, Sarah failed to notice the fractures forming in her carefully maintained facade. Her suburban life and her secret existence were no longer running parallel but beginning to collide. And the consequences of that collision were drawing ever closer. One evening, as Sarah was preparing to record another entry in her journal, she froze. The journal, her most guarded possession, was not where she always kept it. She tore through her closet, rifling through clothes and boxes, her panic growing with each passing second. It was gone. A cold wave of dread washed over her as she realized the magnitude of what this meant. Someone had discovered her secret. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Mark. It seemed unlikely he was rarely in their bedroom closet. Could it have been one of the children? The thought horrified her, but she quickly dismissed it. They were too young to understand. Whoever it was, they now held the key to her double life, and she had no idea what they intended to do with it. The answer came a few days later in the form of an unmarked envelope left in the mailbox. Inside was a photocopy of one of her journal pages, a particularly detailed account of an encounter, and a single chilling sentence scrawled across the bottom: "I know what you've been doing." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. Someone was watching her, and they wanted her to know it. Sarah's carefully constructed life began to crumble under the weight of fear. She started jumping at shadows, convinced she was being followed. The pressure seeped into every aspect of her existence. At home, she was jumpy and irritable, snapping at Mark and the children over minor inconveniences. At night, she lay awake, replaying every moment, every decision that had led her to this point. Mark, meanwhile, had grown more suspicious of Sarah's behavior. Her absences, her erratic mood swings, and now the paranoia she tried unsuccessfully to hide it all pointed to something she wasn't telling him. Determined to uncover the truth, he began looking through her belongings when she wasn't home. He found her tablet one day and discovered a series of messages that hinted at secret rendezvous. His worst fears were confirmed. Sarah was hiding something from him. Fueled by a mix of anger and heartbreak, Mark started piecing together Sarah's actions. He didn't confront her directly, choosing instead to gather more evidence. He began trailing her on nights when she claimed to be out running errands or visiting friends. What he found shocked him. Sarah's paranoia only grew as she began receiving more messages. Each one revealed new details about her secret life, things only someone with access to her journal could know. The messages ranged from vague threats to disturbingly specific observations: "You looked nervous last night. Afraid someone might see you." As her world unraveled, Sarah realized she couldn't confide in anyone. The thought of Mark discovering the truth terrified her, and she had no one else she trusted. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, haunted by a faceless figure who seemed to know her every move. The walls of her two lives, once so carefully kept apart, were crumbling. Sarah could feel the inevitability of it all, but she had no idea just how devastating the collapse would be. The messages became more frequent, and their tone shifted from taunting to demanding. Sarah received instructions to meet her blackmailer at a specific location, an abandoned industrial site on the outskirts of town. The message was clear: come alone, and no one else needed to know. Sarah's first instinct was to ignore it, but the risk of further exposure loomed large. Whoever had her journal held the power to destroy her life, and she couldn't bear the thought of her family and community discovering her secret. Her hands shook as she prepared for the meeting. She slipped a small knife into her handbag, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it someone from her secret world? A stranger who had stumbled across her journal? Or worse, someone she knew? The fear was paralyzing, but she pushed through it, driven by a desperate need to regain control of the situation. The site was dark and desolate, the kind of place that felt eerily cut off from the rest of the world. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped out of her car and scanned the area. She clutched her bag tightly, ready to flee at the slightest hint of danger. A single figure emerged from the shadows, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Mark. He stood under the dim light of a rusting street lamp, her journal in hand. His face was a mixture of anger and heartbreak, emotions barely contained beneath a tense exterior. Sarah froze, her mind reeling. Mark's presence was both a shock and a relief. He wasn't some faceless predator or a stranger from her secret world. He was her husband. But that realization brought no comfort, only dread. Mark revealed that he had been the one sending the messages. His suspicions had grown over the past months, and his discovery of her journal confirmed everything. The photocopies, the instructions, the carefully orchestrated paranoia, it had all been his doing. He wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, to understand the pain she had caused. Sarah's relief at his confession quickly turned to fear as his tone shifted. He accused her of destroying their marriage, of putting their family at risk for the sake of her selfish desires. Every word he spoke cut deeper than the last, his rage spilling over like a dam that had finally burst. Sarah tried to explain, to justify her actions as a desperate attempt to find meaning in a life that felt stifling. But Mark wasn't interested in excuses. The confrontation escalated quickly. Mark's voice grew louder, his movements more aggressive. Sarah, overwhelmed and cornered, reached for the knife in her bag. She didn't plan to use it, she just wanted to feel some sense of control. But in the heat of the moment, as Mark stepped closer, the situation spiraled out of control. The knife flashed in the dim light, and everything changed in an instant. Sarah's world, already on the brink of collapse, shattered completely. She could barely comprehend what had just happened, but the consequences were all too real. The night's events had taken a turn she could never undo. The blade glinted under the faint glow of the street lamp as Sarah stumbled backward, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. Mark crumpled to his knees, clutching his abdomen as blood seeped between his fingers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just done. The sharp, metallic scent of blood filled the air, mingling with the cold night breeze. Mark gasped for breath, his strength fading with each passing second. No, Sarah whispered, rushing forward in a panic. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands over his wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. Tears streamed down her face as she begged him to hold on, her voice shaking with desperation. But it was too late. Mark's eyes, filled with pain and disbelief, fluttered shut as his body went still. For a long moment, Sarah knelt there, her hands trembling as they hovered over his lifeless form. Her mind raced with chaotic thoughts. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She hadn't meant to hurt him. It was an accident, a horrible, irreversible accident. But the reality of the situation bore down on her like a crushing weight. Mark was dead, and she was the one who had killed him. Panic overtook her. She couldn't stay there, someone might come. The thought of explaining this, of the police arriving and taking her away in handcuffs, was unbearable. She had to do something. Her first instinct was to hide the evidence, to make it seem as though none of this had happened. She scanned the area, her heart pounding, and spotted a shallow embankment leading to a nearby lake. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, Sarah dragged Mark's body toward the water. The effort was grueling, her hands slick with blood as she struggled to move him. When she finally reached the edge, she pushed his body into the dark, still water, watching as it sank below the surface. Her chest heaved with exertion, and her vision blurred with tears. Back at home, Sarah frantically scrubbed the blood from her hands and clothes, disposing of the knife and any evidence she could think of. She rehearsed her story, crafting an alibi that would hold up if anyone asked. But the guilt was unbearable, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. When Mark's disappearance was reported a few days later, Sarah played the role of the concerned wife, answering questions and feigning worry. But when the police found his body floating in the lake, her facade began to crack. The autopsy revealed the stab wound, and investigators quickly pieced together the timeline. Her journal, the root of her secret life and the evidence of her obsession, was discovered during a search of their home. It painted a damning picture of Sarah's double life, casting her as a woman consumed by her desires and driven to violence. The trial was swift and sensational. Sarah's perfect image was shattered in the public eye as the truth came to light. She was convicted of Mark's murder and sentenced to life in prison, her story becoming a cautionary tale about obsession and betrayal. Alone in her cell, Sarah had nothing left but her memories and the crushing weight of regret.